Imagine being trapped in a house for over 20 years. No freedom, no outside world. Just fear, isolation, and the constant presence of your captor. Now, imagine your only way out is setting the very place that imprisoned you on fire. This is not a horror movie. This is the shocking real-life case of a man held captive in Connecticut for more than 2 decades by his own stepmother. It's the dead of night, but Daniel Carter's mind is racing. He lies on the thin, musty mattress, staring up at the dim, flickering light overhead. His body aches, but the pain is nothing compared to the mental strain of what he's about to do. The walls of the basement press in on him. It's been his world for as long as he can remember. No windows, no doors leading to freedom. The air is stale, the smell of mildew and decay thick in his nostrils. It's suffocating. He hasn't seen sunlight in years. It's been so long since he felt the warmth of an open sky above him. His body is trapped, but his mind is free. And tonight, he's making a choice that will change everything. He's been waiting for this moment, building up the courage to do something he once thought impossible. He could hear the sounds of Kimberly's car pulling out of the driveway. She'd left for groceries, just like every other time. She believed he would be too scared to act, too submissive to do anything that would get him noticed. But what Kimberly never counted on was Daniel's will to survive. The sound of the flames flickering to life fills his ears, and for the first time in years, he feels something akin to hope. He watches as the fire begins to spread slowly, devouring the old, dry carpet, inching its way toward the corner where he's hidden the lighter fluid he managed to steal from her stash. There's a thrill in the danger, a rush of adrenaline he hasn't felt in ages. It's terrifying, but it's also his only shot at freedom. As the fire spreads, Daniel doesn't hesitate. He moves swiftly, despite his weakened body, towards the window. It's his last chance to escape, to see the world outside the prison he's been confined to for more than 2 decades. The fire alarms screech in the background, but they're no match for the overwhelming roar of the flames as they lick at the ceiling. In the distance, he hears sirens wailing. The first sign that someone has noticed the smoke, that someone is coming. But for now, it's too late to stop the inevitable. Daniel has one mission now: to get out, to escape, to survive. As the sirens grow louder, Daniel presses his ear against the cold concrete wall, his heart hammering in his chest. He can't stop shaking, but he forces himself to steady his breath. The smoke is thickening now, curling into his lungs. He coughs, but it doesn't matter. He's come too far to back out now. Daniel doesn't know how long it's been since he last saw daylight. How many days have passed since he was last allowed outside the walls of the house? His memories of the world beyond are hazy, slipping away as the years of isolation have piled on top of one another. He clings to them anyway, the memories of the world before the prison he now calls home. At 11, Daniel had been just a boy, full of dreams. His mother, gone in an instant, had left him to cling to his father's promises. But when his father remarried just months after her death, everything changed. Kimberly Sullivan entered their lives with an air of sweetness and calm, offering to help him through the loss. But the help came with strings. She didn't love him. She never had. She was after control. And soon, Daniel was forced to learn that a locked door was his only boundary, and silence was his only form of resistance. For years, he lived in that hellish silence, confined to the basement, punished for things that weren't his fault. His father, too lost in his own grief, never saw the signs. Kimberly kept him isolated, kept him in the dark, and kept him locked away from the world. No friends, no family, only Kimberly and the house that became his tomb. The crackling of the fire intensifies. Daniel stumbles toward the window, using all the strength he has left in his frail body. The world outside is a distant memory. one he's unsure even exists anymore. But as he peers through the smoke and the chaos, he can see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles reflecting off the trees. The sound of tires screeching to a halt, the chatter of voices, the crash of sirens. This is it. This is his chance. His heart pounds, every second feeling like an eternity. There's no going back now. The fire, the smoke, the sirens, all of it is part of the plan. It's part of his desperate attempt to break free. As he watches the flashing lights grow closer, something stirs deep within him. Fear, yes, but also something stronger. Relief. For the first time in more than 2 decades, he feels the possibility of a life beyond this suffocating cage. He knows this moment is his only shot, but will it be enough? Will anyone believe him when they find out the truth? The flames roar behind him, consuming everything he's known. And yet, as the darkness presses in on him, he steps toward the open window, toward the unknown world that awaits him on the other side. As the flames raged in the basement, Daniel pressed his face against the cold window, his pulse racing. He could hear the fire trucks getting closer, the screech of tires, the distant voices of first responders. His hands trembled as he tried to steady himself, but there was no turning back. This was it, his chance at freedom, his only chance. For years, Daniel had planned for this moment. Each day had been a quiet calculation. Each second spent trapped in that dark, oppressive basement had brought him closer to one goal: escape. He'd studied the house, memorizing the smallest details, watching for weaknesses, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The fire was his last resort. He'd tried everything else, screaming out of windows, picking at locks, even attempting to bribe the neighbors' children with promises of candy, hoping they'd alert someone to his presence. But every time, Kimberly had been one step ahead. She always locked him away, or shut him down, before anyone could catch on. Daniel had learned to live in silence, to live without hope, but through it all, he never stopped dreaming of the day he could escape. The fire, dangerous, reckless, was the one move he hadn't dared try until now. It was his final act of defiance, the one thing that could break through the walls Kimberly had built around him. As the flames crackled and the smoke began to fill the basement, Daniel stood frozen for a moment, listening. He could hear the faint sound of boots hitting the ground, the crunch of gravel as the first responders raced toward the house. His heart pounded, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was the electric rush of adrenaline, of finally being seen, of finally being heard. He had done it. He had sparked a fire that would change his life forever. The sound of the sirens outside grew louder, and within moments, a pair of firemen appeared at the basement door. They hammered on the door, shouting his name. Daniel could barely hear them over the roar of the flames, but their presence was enough. His heart leapt in his chest as they broke the door down and rushed inside. The firemen, startled by the intensity of the blaze, quickly assessed the situation. They yelled for Daniel, but the smoke was thick and the visibility was low. They moved cautiously, carefully making their way down the narrow basement steps, their flashlights slicing through the haze of smoke. Daniel stumbled toward the firemen, feeling his legs give way beneath him. He had been so weak, so starved. The sight of the firemen, the promise of freedom, overwhelmed him. As one of the men reached out to help him, Daniel collapsed into his arms, gasping for breath. "Hey, we've got you," the fireman said, his voice calm but urgent. "We're going to get you out of here." The firemen didn't waste any time. One of them quickly radioed for additional backup, and within moments, paramedics arrived. As they pulled him from the house, Daniel could barely comprehend what was happening. He was alive. He was free. He was no longer confined to the hell he had lived in for so long. As they loaded him into the ambulance, the flashing lights of the fire trucks and police cars illuminated the night sky. Daniel's body trembled uncontrollably, his mind struggling to make sense of the reality that was unfolding. He was free, but a part of him couldn't escape the haunting images of the basement, the cold, suffocating darkness that had been his world for so many years. He wasn't sure how he had made it out, or why no one had seen the signs, but he knew one thing. He had to tell someone. He had to make them understand what had happened to him. The fire was contained, but the damage had been done. The authorities were immediately called in to investigate the cause of the blaze. But it didn't take long for the situation to take a darker turn. The detectives who arrived at the scene were shocked by the severity of the fire, but they were even more stunned when they learned the identity of the victim. Daniel Carter, a young man who had been missing for years, was now the center of an investigation that would uncover a terrifying truth. He had been held captive by his stepmother, Kimberly Sullivan, for over 20 years. Detectives began combing through the house, and what they found was nothing short of chilling. The basement, where Daniel had spent most of his life, was a grim, makeshift prison. The walls were covered in grime, the air thick with mildew. A thin mattress lay on the floor, a bucket for waste in the corner. There was no sign of comfort, no trace of love, just the remnants of a twisted, abusive relationship between a man and his captor. As the investigation progressed, detectives uncovered evidence of Kimberly's manipulation. She had convinced Daniel that the outside world was dangerous, that he was better off staying in the basement where it was safe. She had isolated him from the outside world, telling him that no one would believe his story if he ever tried to escape. And worst of all, she had been collecting government benefits in his name for years, claiming that Daniel was severely disabled and required constant care. Kimberly had become an expert at lying, at manipulating both Daniel and the authorities. She had played the role of the concerned stepmother to perfection, even convincing the neighbors that Daniel was sick and bedridden. But now, the truth was coming to light, and it was clear. The man who had been kept hidden for so long was not only a victim of extreme abuse, but also a victim of a cruel, systematic scam. As the investigators dug deeper, they discovered even more unsettling details about Kimberly's past. It turned out that she had been involved in similar schemes before, manipulating people for her own gain. She had previously been arrested for fraud, but the charges had been dropped due to lack of evidence. Now, the authorities were piecing together a darker story, one that painted Kimberly as a master manipulator, someone who had been able to hide her monstrous actions in plain sight for years. Kimberly's psychological tactics were chilling. She had told Daniel time and time again that the world outside was far worse than anything he could imagine, that no one would ever care about him. And for so long, Daniel had believed her. He had believed that if he tried to escape, he would be thrown into prison, that no one would ever believe the horrors he had endured. But now, with Kimberly's arrest imminent, the truth was finally emerging. And for Daniel, it was both a moment of relief and a bitter realization. The world he had been kept from was so much worse than he had ever imagined, but not in the way Kimberly had told him. It was worse because it had taken so long for anyone to notice that he was missing. As the investigation into Daniel's captivity continued, detectives uncovered even more unsettling details. This time, it was the money trail that led them to a disturbing revelation. Kimberly Sullivan had been collecting government checks in Daniel's name for years, claiming he was severely disabled and in need of constant care. The authorities were horrified as they pieced together the extent of Kimberly's deception. She had been receiving benefits from both state and federal programs, all while Daniel was locked away in a basement, suffering in isolation. The checks, some of which amounted to thousands of dollars, were deposited into Kimberly's account. She used Daniel's name and social security number to continue the fraud, all while telling anyone who asked that Daniel had been too sick to leave the house. Kimberly had carefully crafted a false narrative, one that portrayed Daniel as a helpless, severely disabled boy, trapped in his own body, unable to speak, unable to move. To the outside world, Daniel didn't even exist. She had convinced neighbors, doctors, and even social workers that he was a special case, a child who needed constant private care, never revealing the horrifying truth that he was nothing more than a prisoner in a dark, rotting basement. The money was flowing in, and Kimberly was living a life of comfort, while Daniel endured unimaginable pain. For years, she had used his name to fund a lifestyle built on lies. But now, with the truth coming to light, the authorities were determined to track every penny she had stolen from the system, and every inch of the life she had built on Daniel's misery. As investigators delved deeper into Kimberly's history, it became clear that the horror of Daniel's captivity wasn't limited to physical abuse. Kimberly had waged a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation that left Daniel broken, unable to trust his own instincts, questioning his worth and his reality. She had convinced him, over and over again, that the world outside was a dangerous place. "The people out there don't care about you," she would tell him. "They'll throw you in jail, lock you away. They'll think you're crazy if you ever try to tell them what's happening." She made him believe that his only option was to stay in the basement, where it was safe. In Kimberly's twisted world, the outside world was a far worse prison, full of people who would hurt him even more than she ever had. "If you leave, you'll die out there," she would say, her voice cold and calculated. Daniel's isolation was complete. Every contact with the outside world was manipulated. He had no access to phones, no contact with the neighbors or even distant relatives. Kimberly's control over him was so absolute that even when Daniel's father was alive, he didn't notice the growing signs of abuse. Kimberly had kept him isolated from the rest of the world, ensuring that no one would ask the right questions. But as Daniel grew older, something shifted. His mind, though battered, began to fight back. He started questioning her words, questioning the reality she had forced him to accept. What was out there? Why had he never been allowed to see it? The seeds of doubt had been planted, and soon they would take root in his mind. It wasn't just the physical torment that wore Daniel down. It was the constant mental and emotional manipulation that kept him prisoner in his own mind. Kimberly had worked hard to make sure he never felt like he could break free, to convince him that he was nothing, that no one would care if he vanished from the world. But slowly, as the years went by, Daniel's hope, though fragile, began to re-emerge. He started to notice things, little things. He would overhear the neighbors talking about their children, laughing, playing outside. He would hear the voices of people passing by on the street, their lives moving forward without him. For a moment, the walls of the basement seemed to shrink, and the space that had once felt like the only world he knew became unbearably small. One night, after Kimberly had left for one of her regular trips, Daniel made the decision that would change everything. He had spent years planning, trying to figure out a way to escape. He had tried picking locks, tapping on walls, even trying to shout for help when the wind carried voices across the yard. But now his thoughts turned to something bolder, something that had always been in the back of his mind but seemed too dangerous to attempt. He had watched enough movies to know how fires spread. He knew how a small spark could grow into a roaring flame, and so he made his choice. He didn't want to die, but he knew if he didn't act, he would never have another chance. The fire he set in the basement wasn't just an act of desperation. It was his one last shot at freedom. When Kimberly Sullivan was arrested, the authorities were shocked by her complete lack of remorse. She had been living in a motel, just miles from the house where she had kept Daniel for so long. She had fled after realizing that Daniel had survived the fire and that her twisted control over him was about to unravel. When detectives brought her in for questioning, they were ready for a fight, but Kimberly was stone cold. She had no emotions, no tears, just a hardened arrogance that chilled everyone in the room. "He's fine," Kimberly scoffed when asked about Daniel. "He had everything he needed. I took care of him. You people just don't understand." The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was clear that Kimberly didn't see her actions as wrong. In her eyes, she had done nothing but care for Daniel the way he needed to be cared for. The fact that he had been locked in a basement, starved, beaten, and emotionally broken, none of that mattered to her. Her indifference was terrifying. Kimberly wasn't just a monster. She was someone who had perfected the art of manipulation, someone who believed she could control the narrative. Even as she was arrested, she refused to accept responsibility for the nightmare she had inflicted upon Daniel. Kimberly's trial was one of the most shocking and emotionally charged in recent memory. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as the prosecution presented evidence of the years of abuse Daniel had suffered. Photos of the basement, of the filthy, locked room where Daniel had been held. Evidence that made even the most hardened officers and lawyers recoil in disgust. When Daniel took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He was no longer the frail, broken boy he had been when he was found. He was a young man, scarred but determined to tell his story. His voice cracked as he described the horrors he had endured, the days, the weeks, the years of isolation. He spoke of Kimberly's cruelty, her manipulation, the lies she had told him to keep him trapped. Kimberly's defense tried to paint her as a misunderstood woman, someone who had acted out of care for Daniel. But it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that the woman standing before them was nothing short of a monster. As the trial continued, the weight of the evidence grew undeniable. The jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. Kimberly Sullivan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for Daniel, the sentence wasn't enough. He knew that no punishment could undo the years of torment. No sentence could heal the wounds that still haunted him. And while justice had been served, the battle for his own healing was only just beginning. The day Daniel Carter was freed felt like the world was both a dream and a nightmare. The fire had brought his captivity to light, but in the aftermath, he found himself standing in a world that seemed almost foreign. Everything had changed in the 20 years he had been locked away. Technology, culture, and society had evolved at a pace he couldn't fathom. Simple things like ordering food, using a phone, or driving a car felt like alien concepts, as if he had woken up from a long slumber in a completely different world. Freedom, which he had so desperately longed for, came at a price. The psychological wounds were deep, and no amount of physical recovery could undo the damage Kimberly had done to his mind. For the first time in his life, Daniel had to confront the reality of everything he had lost. The years stolen from him, the dreams never realized, and the relationships that had faded into oblivion while he was locked away. Therapists and counselors were quick to offer help, but healing was not something that could be fixed overnight. Daniel often found himself staring at blank walls, feeling like an outsider in a world that was moving on without him. The memories of the cold, dark basement still haunted him. The whispers of isolation, the harsh commands of his stepmother, and the relentless pressure of surviving in an environment that stripped him of everything: his childhood, his innocence, his identity. Yet, Daniel was resilient. He refused to let those memories define his future. It wasn't easy, and there were days when he felt like the weight of the world was too much to bear. But as the weeks and months passed, Daniel began to reclaim his life, step by small step. He started attending therapy regularly and joined a support group for survivors of trauma. Slowly, he began to rebuild his sense of self-worth. Despite everything, Daniel had an inner strength that refused to be extinguished. While Daniel struggled to find his place in the world, Kimberly Sullivan's fate was sealed behind prison bars. The trial had ended, and the guilty verdict had been delivered. But in the quiet of her prison cell, Kimberly still denied the depth of her actions. She never truly grasped the magnitude of the harm she had inflicted upon Daniel. She refused to acknowledge that she was anything but a victim of her circumstances, and her indifference to her own role in the abuse made her all the more chilling. Her time in prison was a quiet one, isolated from the other inmates due to the nature of her crime. She spent her days in a routine of solitude, and though the authorities kept tabs on her, she showed no signs of remorse. Kimberly had always been calculating, and even behind bars, she maintained a sense of control over her own life. To her, the outside world no longer mattered. Yet, as the years passed, whispers from fellow inmates began to surface. Kimberly had started to open up, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of expressing guilt or regret, she began to downplay her actions, portraying herself as the real victim. "He needed to be kept safe," she told others, her words dripping with justification. "The world is a cruel place. I was protecting him." But no matter how she tried to spin the story, it was clear that Kimberly's ability to manipulate had not faltered. Whether it was her way of justifying the unthinkable or simply clinging to the last bit of control she could exert, Kimberly's story remained the same. She had done what was necessary, and she had done it for Daniel's own good. As Daniel continued to heal, he took matters into his own hands. One of his main goals was to ensure that Kimberly would not just serve time for the horrific acts she had committed, but would also face the consequences of her financial exploitation. The government checks she had fraudulently collected in Daniel's name had gone unnoticed for years. Thousands of dollars had been stolen. Money that was meant for Daniel's care. Money that was used to fund Kimberly's twisted control over his life. Daniel, with the help of a legal team, sought to hold Kimberly accountable for more than just her physical abuse. It was time to make sure she paid for every dollar she had taken from the system, using his name as a tool for her selfish gain. The battle was long, and it took months of paperwork and investigation, but in the end, Daniel was able to recover a significant portion of the stolen funds. But for Daniel, this was more than just about the money. It was about taking back what was his. Every dollar was a symbol of the years Kimberly had stolen from him. It was his way of reclaiming something. Anything from the life that had been stolen, piece by piece, each court filing. Each victory was another small step toward the freedom he had always dreamed of, a victory over the woman who had tried to break him. In the years following his rescue, Daniel made remarkable progress. Though the road was long and filled with challenges, he never gave up. Therapy sessions became a lifeline, and over time, he learned to understand that his past did not define him. He still carried the scars, both physical and emotional, but he had also learned to find moments of peace in the small victories. The simple joy of walking down a street without the constant fear of being trapped. The happiness of sitting at a dinner table with people who cared about him. The warmth of human connection that had once been so foreign to him. Daniel had dreamed of becoming a firefighter, a dream he had abandoned long ago. But now, as an adult, he saw a new purpose emerging. He began volunteering with organizations that helped survivors of abuse and trauma, using his story to inspire others to fight for their own freedom. He shared his experiences in the hope that someone, somewhere, might hear his words and find the strength to escape their own captivity. It was through these acts of kindness and bravery that Daniel truly began to heal. He realized that his journey to freedom wasn't just about escaping the basement. It was about rediscovering his place in the world, a world he thought he had lost forever. Daniel's story was a reminder that no one is truly alone, no matter how dark their circumstances may seem. It was a reminder that, even in the deepest depths of isolation, there is always hope. He had spent 20 years trapped in a nightmare, but now he was free. And though his journey was far from over, Daniel knew one thing for certain. He had survived, and in surviving, he had become stronger than anyone could ever have imagined. Life is not what happened to me. Daniel often says in interviews and speeches, "Life is what I do with what happened to me." His story continues to inspire others, and though the pain of his past will never fully fade, he moves forward with the knowledge that his resilience can make a difference. The nightmares still come, but he faces them head-on, armed with the strength to fight another day. For Daniel, the road to recovery is a lifelong journey, but as he moves through the world, he does so with the unbreakable knowledge that no one, not even the darkest of captors, can take away his hope, his future, or his will to live. What do you think of Daniel's story? Can we do more to help those who might be trapped in situations of abuse and captivity? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, you have the power to make a difference. If you see someone in danger, speak up. Your voice could be the one that saves them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that shed light on the darkness of the world and the resilience of the human spirit.